My name is Vivian Okafor, and if you give me enough of your time today, I promise you will walk away understanding something most people spend their whole lives learning the hard way. Patience is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And the people who laugh the loudest at you are usually the ones who know the least about who you really are. But before I get to the part where everything flipped, I need to take you back to a Sunday afternoon in October, because that is where this story truly begins. That is the day my own grandson's wife stood in front of her entire family, looked me dead in the eye, and decided I was nothing. I had driven 2 hours from my house in Raleigh to their place in Charlotte. My grandson Darnell had called me the week before, excited, telling me his in-laws were throwing a welcome dinner for the newlyweds. He wanted me there. So I ironed my good blouse, put gas in my Civic, and made the drive because that is what grandmothers do. We show up, no matter what. The house belonged to his wife's parents, the Hargrove family. Big colonial in a gated neighborhood. The kind with a stone fountain in the driveway that nobody actually uses but everyone maintains, because of what it signals to the neighbors. I parked along the street because the driveway was already full of newer cars than mine. When I rang the bell, a housekeeper opened the door before I could even lower my hand. Inside, there were maybe 30 people. Darnell found me quickly, hugged me, and started steering me toward the living room where his wife Chanel stood in a cream dress looking like she had been born for exactly this kind of room. She was beautiful. I had always thought so. What I did not know yet was what kind of person she had decided to be. Her mother, Rochelle Hargrove, came over with a smile so practiced it barely moved her eyes. She greeted me politely enough, the way you greet someone you have already decided does not belong in your house but cannot say so out loud. Her husband Warren stood nearby, one hand wrapped around a glass of bourbon, the other tucked in the pocket of his blazer like he was posing for a portrait nobody had commissioned. I found a seat near the window, close to an older woman I did not recognize who gave me a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. We talked about nothing important. The food, the drive, the weather. It was comfortable. Then Warren Hargrove tapped his glass with a butter knife. The room quieted. He launched into a toast about family and legacy in the Hargrove name, about how their daughter had married well and how their bloodline was one of achievement and ambition. It went on longer than it needed to. When Chanel's brother Raymond stepped up to add his own words, I could already feel where the evening was going. Raymond was the kind of man who mistakes cruelty for wit. Loud, certain of his own humor, the sort who always has an audience because he knows how to hold one. He raised his glass, looked around the room with a grin, and then let his eyes land on me. "And of course," he said, drawing it out, "we welcome Darnell's grandmother, the little church mouse who rode the bus in from wherever." Laughter. Not all of it, but enough. Warren chuckled. Rochelle pressed her lips together in the way people do when they are pretending not to find something funny. A few of the cousins laughed freely because they did not know any better or did not care. I did not ride a bus. I drove my own car, but that was not the point, and everyone in that room knew it. I looked at Darnell. He had gone very still. His jaw was tight. But he did not say anything, not one word. He glanced at Chanel, and she was looking at her champagne glass, twirling the stem between her fingers. She did not look at me. She did not look at her brother. She just waited for the moment to pass, which it did, because Raymond moved on with his toast, and the room exhaled and refilled their glasses. And that was the thing that cut the deepest. Not Raymond's words. He was a stranger to me. Someone I owed nothing and who owed me nothing in return, but Darnell. My Darnell. The boy I had driven to baseball practice when his parents were working doubles. The boy I had sat with at the kitchen table every Tuesday after school for 3 years because his reading was behind and his teacher said he needed extra help. The boy who called me every birthday and every Christmas and told me I was his favorite person on earth. He sat in that room and let his wife's brother make me the punchline, and he said nothing. I folded my hands in my lap and I looked out the window at that stone fountain, and I breathed. I had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do in a room full of people who want to see you react is react. So I did not. I stayed for another 40 minutes. I ate a plate of food. I said goodbye to Darnell with a hug that he held a beat too long, and I could feel the apology in it that he could not bring himself to say out loud. I said goodnight to Rochelle, who told me to drive safe, and I walked back to my Civic and sat in it for a moment before pulling out into the street. On the drive home, I passed a billboard advertising a new luxury apartment complex going up on the east side of the city. I knew that land. I had known it for 16 years. Let me tell you who I really am, because the Hargroves never bothered to find out. I was widowed at 51 when my husband Leonard passed from a heart attack that gave us no warning and no time to prepare. We had a modest life. A house we were still paying off. 2 cars, enough saved to get by for a few months if something went wrong. When Leonard died, I had about $40,000 in savings, a lot of grief, and a very clear sense that no one was coming to rescue me. My daughter, Darnell's mother, was living in Atlanta with her husband and doing fine. She offered to help, but I told her to keep her money for her own children. I was not going to become someone's burden. I decided the only person responsible for what happened next was me. I had always been interested in real estate, not in the way people talk about it at dinner parties, flipping houses and making it sound glamorous. I mean, I was genuinely interested in land and how cities grow, in which neighborhoods are undervalued now and will not be in 15 years. I had been reading about it since the 1990s when Leonard was alive and thought it was a hobby at best and a distraction at worst. He was a kind man, my husband, but he did not think the way I thought about money. After he passed, I started small. I sold the house we had been living in, which had appreciated more than either of us realized, and I used that money to buy a duplex in a neighborhood people were still dismissing as coming back. I did not tell my daughter. I did not tell my friends at church. I fixed it up myself where I could and hired out what I could not. Within 3 years, I was collecting rent from both units and living in a small apartment I was also renting out the back portion of. The money went back in, every time. I was not spending it. I was not buying a newer car or taking trips to prove something to someone. I was building something that no one could see yet. By the time Darnell was in middle school, I owned 4 properties in Raleigh and had an LLC that meant none of them were tied to my name in any obvious way. I drove the same Civic. I wore the same sensible clothes. I ate at home most nights and packed my lunch on the days I still worked part-time at the county assessor's office, which was not coincidental. Working there taught me things about land records and tax assessments that most investors pay consultants to understand. I left that job at 62. By then, I had 12 properties and 2 commercial lots that I was sitting on because I knew the corridor they were in was going to change. I had been watching the city's development plans for years. I knew where the new transit line was going before most of the developers had figured it out. I bought accordingly. No one around me knew. Not my neighbors, not my church friends, not my daughter, and certainly not Darnell's future in-laws. Warren Hargrove knew me as the grandmother from Raleigh, the church mouse who drove a Civic, the woman his son-in-law spoke about with affection, which in Warren's world translated to irrelevant. What Warren did not know was that one of my commercial parcels sat directly adjacent to a mixed-use development he had been trying to close on for 2 years. His firm was the developer. He needed that parcel to make his project viable. The access road ran through my land. His broker had been trying to reach the owner of that parcel through an LLC layer for 14 months. The owner had not responded because the owner had no reason to rush, and because the owner had been watching to see how Warren Hargrove conducted himself before deciding whether to do business with him at all. I had been watching him for over a year before that dinner party. What I saw at the dinner confirmed what I had already suspected. In the weeks after that Sunday, I thought about Darnell often. I did not call him. I waited to see if he would call me. He did about 10 days later, with a voice that carried something heavy in it, and he said, "Grandma, I'm sorry about Raymond. He was out of line." And I said, "I know he was," and there was a silence, and then he said, "Chanel didn't know he was going to say that." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "I'm always all right, baby. I'll talk to you soon." I hung up and sat with what had been left unsaid. He did not ask what I thought of him for staying quiet. He did not say he wished he had spoken up. He moved the responsibility onto his brother-in-law and offered his wife's innocence as a closing argument. That told me something I did not want to know about who my grandson had become in that marriage. about what he had already started giving up in the name of keeping the peace in a house where the peace was not really his to keep. I did not blame Chanel entirely. I had watched women disappear into families like the Hargroves before. It is a slow erasure. You adopt their manners, their vocabulary, their hierarchy of who matters and who does not. By the time you realize you have changed, it no longer feels like a loss. But I was not willing to be the thing she erased. Warren's project moved to a critical phase in the spring. The parcel question had become urgent. His broker sent another letter through the LLC, this time with a substantially higher offer, because Warren had finally understood that without that land, the access permits would not clear and the whole timeline would collapse. He had investors who were already impatient. He had a contractor on standby who was not going to wait forever. I read the letter on a Tuesday morning at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and took my time before I called my attorney. I did not reject the offer. I did not accept it either. I told my attorney to request a meeting. Warren arrived at my attorney's office on the Thursday afternoon in a suit that probably cost more than my first duplex. He brought his own attorney and a younger man I recognized as his project manager. They sat down across the table with the quiet confidence of people who believe they already know how a conversation is going to end. My attorney introduced me as the principal of the LLC. Warren looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that he was not quite fast enough to hide. It was not guilt. It was recalculation. He was running numbers, replaying information, trying to fit what he thought he knew about me against what was sitting in front of him right now. I let him take his time. "Vivian," he said, and I noticed he did not say Mrs. Okafor. "We've met before." "We have," I said, "at Darnell and Chanel's welcome dinner." "That's right." He set his pen down on the notepad in front of him and leaned back. "I had no idea you were involved in real estate." I looked at him steadily. Most people don't. His attorney tried to steer us back toward the offer, which was the right instinct. But Warren was not quite done processing. He looked at me again, and I could see him going back through what Raymond had said. The laughter, the church mouse comment, the way his wife had smiled into her champagne. He was calculating the cost of that evening in a currency he actually understood. "We'd like to move forward on this," he said, and his voice had changed. The performance was still there, but the certainty underneath it had shifted. "We're prepared to come up on the number," I said. "I appreciate that, but before we talk about numbers, I want to talk about terms." The meeting lasted 2 hours. I was unhurried throughout. My attorney had advised me that my position was extremely strong and that I had no obligation to accommodate their timeline. I already knew that. What I wanted from that meeting was not just a favorable contract. I wanted Warren Hargrove to sit across a table from the woman his family had dismissed and understand, clause by clause, that she was the one deciding what happened next. We reached an agreement. The terms were mine. The timeline was mine. And the development that would reshape that corridor of Charlotte and generate more returns than Warren had budgeted for would clear through a parcel that had belonged quietly to the church mouse from Raleigh. I told Darnell myself. I drove down to Charlotte on a Saturday and I asked him to meet me for coffee, just the two of us, at a place near his apartment. He came in looking worried because I had asked specifically for just him and he knew something was coming. I told him about the properties. Not all of it at once, but enough. I told him about the duplex after Leonard died, about the LLC, about the commercial lots and what they were worth now. I watched his face move through several expressions before settling on something I can only describe as stunned stillness. "Grandma," he said, "why didn't you ever tell me?" I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and I looked at him. "Because I needed to know what kind of man you were before I made you aware of what I had, and I found out." He knew exactly what I meant. He did not flinch from it, which told me there was still something in him worth reaching. "I should have said something that night," he said quietly. "Yes," I said, "you should have. I didn't want to make a scene in front of her family." "I know, but here's the thing about keeping peace at someone else's expense, Darnell. Eventually you have to look that person in the eye. And if you can't, then you already know what you chose." He was quiet for a while. We sat with it. Outside the window, the street was doing its regular Saturday business. A father pushing a stroller. A woman walking 2 dogs. Two teenagers on bikes cutting between parked cars. I love her, he said finally. I know you do. And I love you, I know that too. Can I fix this? I set my cup down. Loving someone means protecting them. Even when it costs you something in front of people you're trying to impress, you didn't protect me. I need you to understand that. Not so you can feel bad, but so you know what to do differently going forward. He nodded, and this time there was no lawyer in it, no deflection. Just my grandson sitting with the weight of what he had let happen. I did not ask him to choose between me and his wife's family. That is not how I operate. What I asked was for him to be honest with himself about who he was becoming and whether that person was one he could live with. We had lunch after the coffee. We talked about his job, about a fishing trip he was planning, about Leonard and how much Darnell had loved spending summers at our house when he was small. It was the most real conversation we had shared in 2 years. The Hargroves found out the full picture at a family dinner in June. Warren had told Rochelle, of course, because there are things a man cannot keep from his wife when they reshape his professional week, she told Chanel. And Chanel, to her credit, came to me directly. She showed up at my door in Raleigh on a weekday afternoon without calling first, which I respected, because calling first gives you the option of being managed. Showing up does not. She stood on my porch in a linen jacket and looked like she had been rehearsing what to say and had decided at the last moment to forget the rehearsal. I owe you an apology, she said. For that dinner, I should have said something to Raymond. I opened the door wider and she came inside. I made tea. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had read Warren's offer letter on a Tuesday morning. I was embarrassed, she said. Not of you. Of him, and I didn't know how to handle it without making everything worse. That's not an excuse. I know that. I looked at her and I believed her, which matters. I am a good judge of when someone is apologizing to relieve themselves and when someone is apologizing because they genuinely understand what they did. This was the second kind. I don't need you to fix Raymond, I said. I need to know my grandson is with a woman who sees him as a partner and not a prop. And I need to know that when it counts, you are not going to let your family use the people he loves as material for a toast. She held my gaze. I understand. Good. We talked for another hour. She asked about Leonard. I asked about her work, which I had never done before because we had never sat still long enough. She was sharper than I had given her credit for, and I told her so, which surprised her enough that she laughed. A real one that broke some of the tension out of the room. She left with the posture of someone who had set something down that they had been carrying too long. Raymond never apologized. I did not expect him to. Some people mistake silence for forgiveness and take it as permission to continue. What they miss is that the silence is not about them at all. My silence has never been about the person I am withholding it from. It has always been about me, about deciding how much of my energy a situation deserves. Raymond does not deserve much of mine. Warren's development is moving forward. The parcel agreement is signed and the access road has been surveyed. He is cordial with me now in the way that powerful men become cordial with people they miscalculated, which is a kind of respect, even if it comes from the wrong place. I will take it. Rochelle called me once after the whole thing came out, and she was gracious about it. More gracious than I expected. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings, and I said I held no grudges against people who did not have information. Which was true. She did not know who I was at that dinner. She knew me as the church mouse from Raleigh, and she treated me accordingly. The failure there was not malice, it was assumption. Raymond's failure was different. He had looked for a target and found one, and performed. That is a choice, not an accident. And choices leave marks. Darnell and I have dinner together now once a month, sometimes in Charlotte, sometimes here. He brought Chanel twice. The second time, she brought a sweet potato pie she had made from scratch and set it on my counter, with an expression that made me think she had been working on the recipe for a while. I cut 2 slices and we ate it standing right there in the kitchen, and it was good. I told her so. I think about Leonard sometimes when I am sitting on the porch in the evenings. He would have been surprised by all of it, the properties, the LLC, the meeting with Warren Hargrove. He would have shaken his head and said, "Vivian, you always did think 3 moves ahead of everybody else." And I would have said, "Leonard, I was just paying attention. He would not have understood that paying attention is the whole game. That most of the time, the difference between the people who are dismissed and the people doing the dismissing comes down to who is watching and who is too busy performing to notice anything at all. That dining room in Charlotte taught me something I already knew but needed to be reminded of. The people who are quickest to reduce you to a category are the ones most afraid of what they do not know. Raymond saw an old woman in a modest blouse who drove 2 hours to sit near a window at a dinner she was not really invited to in spirit. He saw something small and familiar and easy to poke at. He did not see the land records. He did not see the LLC filings. He did not see the 16 years of early mornings and careful decisions, and a woman who had decided, after losing the person she loved most, that she was going to build something that could not be taken away. They thought they were the ones with the table worth sitting at. They had no idea the chair they almost did not offer me was already mine. I am not telling you this story so you will think I am impressive. I am telling you this because somewhere right now someone is laughing at you. Someone has decided that your quietness is ignorance, that your simplicity is limitation, that the life you live modestly must mean you have nothing to offer. They are wrong. And you do not have to prove it today. You do not have to raise your voice at their dinner table or leave early to make a point. You just have to keep building, keep paying attention. Keep your hands steady and your plans quiet and trust that what you are constructing will speak when the time comes. The church mouse from Raleigh rode her own car. She always did. I have been thinking lately about what it actually costs a person to stay quiet in a room full of noise. Not the kind of quiet that comes from having nothing to say. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what you could say and choosing, deliberately, not to say it yet. That is a different thing entirely. Most people cannot tell the difference from the outside, and that is precisely why it works. When Raymond made his joke at that dinner table, he was counting on a reaction. That is what people like Raymond are always counting on. The performance only lands if the target flinches. When I did not flinch, when I folded my hands and looked out the window and gave him nothing, I think some part of him was confused. He moved on because he had to, but the joke did not quite settle the way he wanted it to. I could see it in the way he reached for his drink a little too quickly afterward. What I know now, after 60-some years of watching how things actually unfold, is that the people who are loudest in a room are usually the ones working the hardest to convince themselves of something. Raymond needed that room to believe he was sharp and untouchable. Warren needed it to believe his family name was the most significant thing present. Neither of them had any reason to look closer at the woman near the window, and so they did not. That was their choice. And choices, every single one of them, come back around eventually. Not because of any force outside ourselves. Because of simple arithmetic. The decisions we make shape the conditions we live in. Warren spent years building a project on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. He assumed the parcel owner would be eager, would be a stranger, would be someone he could manage. Those assumptions cost him 14 months and a renegotiation that did not go in his favor. Not because I punished him, because he had not done the work of finding out who he was actually dealing with. That gap between what he assumed and what was true, he created it himself. Darnell is the one I think about most. He is a good man in the process of learning what being a good man actually requires. It is not enough to love the people in your life. Love that does not show up when it is inconvenient is just a feeling, and feelings without action do not protect anyone. He knows this now. I can hear it in how he talks, in the questions he asks, in the way he held that coffee cup and looked at me across the table and did not try to explain his way out of what he had done. That kind of honesty takes something. It takes more than most people are willing to spend. I built what I built because I had no other choice but to think clearly and act carefully and keep going on days when I wanted to stop. That is not inspiration. That is just what surviving requires. The inheritance I leave Darnell is not the properties, not the LLC, not the land records filed quietly in 3 counties. It is the proof that a person can be counted out completely and still, if they pay attention and stay steady, end up holding the terms. That is the only thing worth passing on.